This is a video I've been wanting to make for a while. The new Hamas Charter has been out for several months, and I wanted to look into it and see if it changes anything in how we should view this organization, in how Israel should deal with Gaza, which Hamas rules, and in how Israel should conduct itself vis-à-vis the Palestinians in general. I didn't get to it until now, but seeing as November 2017 marked the 100-year anniversary of the Jewish-Palestinian conflict, this is as good a time as any. It's been 100 years. Have we made any progress? So, to understand the stakes involved in this new Hamas Charter, we're going to have to talk about the history of the conflict. Therefore, I'm going to provide a brief historical review of the past 100 years. Of course, this is not going to be a full analysis of the conflict. What we shall focus on is the history of Arab refusal to accept Israel's right to exist, since that is the main thing we are discussing when we ask if Hamas has changed. So keep in mind that this is a partial picture that I'm portraying. It was in November 1917, after the Brits conquered the land of Israel from the Turks in the First World War, that the British government announced that it would support the idea of turning this land into a national home for the Jews. The idea was not to turn it into a Jewish state, but to allow Jews to immigrate to their historical homeland and form a country together with the local Arab population. This idea, however, encountered immediate resistance from the local Arabs, and from Arabs all over the Middle East. Why did the Arabs object? Well, first of all, it is a human reaction. Humans are usually suspicious of foreigners who come to live among them. But there were also strong ideological components. First, there's Muslim imperialism, the idea that every piece of land that they perceive as belonging to Islam cannot be given away. Secondly, there is the fear from Western invasion, which was and still is very prevalent in the Arab world. The memory of the Crusades is still with them, and they saw this as the beginning of a new crusade. Third, there is anti-Semitism, the belief that Jews are evil and are plotting to disenfranchise them. All of these, combined together, generated a hostile reaction to the idea of a national home for the Jews in Israel. They believed it would not end there, but will result with the Jews and the West taking over the entire Middle East. Or as they put it, either we push the Jews to the sea, or they push us to the Euphrates. This idea, that they must push the Jews to the sea, has remained hanging over the Jewish-Arab relationship for the past century. It should be said that when they are more specific about it, the Arab leaders don't say that the Jews should be thrown into the sea, but pushed into boats on which they would go back to the countries they came from. But in the Jewish consciousness, the idea that the Arabs want to throw us to the sea has been solidified. When there seems to be a chance that the Arabs might make peace with Israel and accept its right to exist, Israeli skeptics react by saying, the Arabs are the same Arabs, and the sea is the same sea. Now, the Palestinians claim that it is their land, which has been taken from them unlawfully. This claim, however, has no legs to stand on. It is true that in 1917 there were about 500,000 Arabs living in the territory which the Brits defined as Palestine, but that doesn't mean that they owned it. As an Israeli individual, I can say that I own the land that is my private property, and I can also claim that I have ownership over the entire land that constitutes the State of Israel. That is because I am a subject of the Israeli government, the government that makes and enforces the laws of this land, the government that is responsible for its protection and development. Since I pay taxes to this government, obey its laws and help in the defense of the land, I can say that this land is my land. But the Arabs living here in 1917, those who would become known as Palestinians, had no Palestinian government. They were subjects of the Ottoman Empire, whose government was in Turkey. So they had ownership over their private land, but any other land belonged to every other subject of the Ottoman Empire just as much as it belonged to them. As a matter of fact, you can argue that there were about the same number of Jews and Palestinians living in the Ottoman Empire at the time, so the Jews had an equal claim. It doesn't matter anyway, because the Ottoman Empire collapsed, and Palestine was no longer under the sovereignty of the Turkish government, so it essentially became no man's land. The League of Nations, which was the international authority at the time, passed a resolution in 1922 that ordained Palestine to be a national home for the Jews, and gave Great Britain a mandate over the land to oversee this process. So the Jews who started to immigrate and settle in Palestine did so legally. The Arabs did not accept the resolution, and turned to violence. 1920 marks the year when Palestinian terrorism began, and ever since then Jews had to live behind walls, and maintain a strong defense force. In the 1930s, the Jews also started to strike back and form their own terrorist groups. But, like I said, we are not talking about this side of the story. The Palestinian violence became so bad that the Brits had to appease them and put limitations on the amount of the Jews that were allowed to come in. And so, in the years when European Jews needed refuge the most, the gates of their homeland were closed before them. It became painfully apparent that Jews and Arabs cannot form a state together. So, after World War II, a UN committee suggested splitting the land into a Jewish state and an Arab state. The part that the Jews got was slightly bigger, but half of it was desert land, so it was a fair deal. Nevertheless, the deal was rejected by the Palestinians and the rest of the Arab world. The plan went before the UN General Assembly and got the 2/3 of the votes needed to pass. However, UNGA resolutions have no legal effectiveness. They are merely recommendations, which are passed on to the UN Security Council. The body of resolutions are legally binding. So, after the UNGA resolution in November 1947 to end the British mandate and form 2 states, it was left for the UNSC to ratify it. The Arabs refused to let this happen, and threatened that if the Security Council adopts this plan, they are going to invade Israel and destroy it. The Americans got cold feet, fearing another Holocaust, and delayed the UNSC vote to find a solution. The Brits, however, were tired of this mess, and announced that they are pulling out by May 1948, leaving the Jews to fend alone against the Arabs. On the day that they left, the newly formed State of Israel was attacked by the armies of 5 Arab countries, and after a bloody war it managed not only to secure its own designated lands, but also to conquer all the lands of Palestine except for the West Bank, which was occupied by Jordan, and the Gaza Strip, which was occupied by Egypt. The Security Council then recognized Israel in these borders, and gave it legal status. But the original plan, the one that included the Palestinian state, never went to a vote, which is why Israel claims to this day that the West Bank and Gaza are legally in limbo. During the Israeli conquests, many Palestinians were driven away from their homes and became refugees. As for the Jews living in the areas occupied by the Arabs, they were, shall we say, ethnically cleansed, in the most thorough way. So there were no Jews left in the West Bank and Gaza, but there were still Arabs living in Israel, and eventually they became Israeli citizens. The UN General Assembly passed a resolution that every Palestinian refugee who wants to go back to their home and live peacefully with their Jewish neighbors should be allowed to do so. Unfortunately, there were no Palestinians who were willing to live peacefully with their Jewish neighbors. The Arabs still believed that they were going to destroy Israel eventually, and kept on denying its right to exist. The refugees were put in refugee camps, as a temporary measure until the day that they will vanquish the Jews and return triumphant to their homes. They are still there. In 1967, the Arab countries once again ganged up on Israel and announced that they are going to destroy it. It resulted in a 6-day war in which Israel conquered the West Bank and Gaza, as well as the Sinai Peninsula and the Golan Heights. Israel announced a new formula: land for peace. If the Arab countries want their land back, they must make peace with Israel and recognize its right to exist. The Arabs rejected the formula at first, but in time, Arab states did start a peace process with Israel. This was also the time in which the Palestinian national movement came to life. The representative of this national movement was the Palestine Liberation Organization, the PLO. It was formed in 1964, at first as part of the Arab coalition against Israel, but after the defeat in the 6-Day War, they realized that the Arab countries will not be their salvation, and decided to go their own way. In 1968, the PLO adopted the Palestinian Charter, a pretty extreme document, written in the radical revolutionary language of the late 60s. The Charter announces that Palestine belongs only to the Palestinians, and all of the international resolutions recognizing the Jewish rights in the place are invalid. It rejects the claim that the Jews are a nation with national rights, and rejects any forms of peace. The only possible solution is the complete elimination of Israel, and the way to achieve it is through war on terrorism. Article 6 states that the Jews who had resided in Palestine before the beginning of the Zionist invasion, i.e. before 1917, will be considered Palestinians. What about the millions of other Jews who were living in Israel in 1968? The Charter doesn't say. It is left to the reader's imagination to figure out what their fate shall be. Palestinian terrorism intensified after that, and became an international menace. But it led the Palestinians nowhere, because neither Israel nor any other Western country considered the PLO a legitimate player, as long as it was ideologically committed to the elimination of Israel. In 1969, the PLO elected a new head, Yasser Arafat, who was more diplomatic than the people who wrote the charter. Under his leadership, the PLO adopted the 10-point plan in 1974, which stated that it is alright to accept temporary political solutions, as long as it advances the Palestinians towards the goal of conquering all of Palestine. This gave Arafat room to maneuver and negotiate deals in which the Palestinians would get only part of the land. But Israel refused to negotiate with the PLO as long as it didn't recognize its right to exist and revoke its charter. It was hard to believe that the PLO will ever accept these terms, but by the late 80s, several things had happened that compelled Arafat to change course. First, the PLO was beaten militarily and financially. Secondly, the Soviet Union was collapsing, so you had to play by American rules. And third, 1987 saw the beginning of a Palestinian popular uprising, Intifada, in the West Bank and Gaza. This made the Palestinians a hot topic, and the PLO had to capitalize. In 1988, Arafat indicated that he is willing to recognize Israel's right to exist. This initiated a hectic period of negotiations, which eventually led to the Oslo Agreement in 1993. The agreement was based on the formula of land for peace. Israel withdrew from parts of the West Bank and Gaza and handed them over to the Palestinian Authority, headed by Arafat. The Palestinian Authority had to show that it can maintain peace and prevent terrorist attacks, and gradually change the Palestinian rhetoric to a peaceful one. In turn, Israel was supposed to gradually hand over more and more lands, until we get to a situation of two states living peacefully side by side. Throughout that period, Arafat was speaking in two tongues. To the Western world he was saying that he wants peace and recognizes Israel's right to exist, but to the Arabs he was saying that it is all in accordance with the 10-point plan. The Palestinian Charter was supposed to be revoked, and there was a process of revocation, but it is unclear if it was actually revoked. For the Israeli right, this was proof that the Arabs are the same Arabs, and the sea is the same sea. The left believed that you have to give the peace process time to bring change. Well, did we make any progress since then? I would say that we did. Arafat is dead now, and his successor Abu Mazen is a lot less ambivalent when he declares his commitment to the two-state solution. To me, there are two lessons to be learned here. The first is that you don't make concessions to someone who is ideologically committed to destroy you. Ideologues believe that the ideology makes them stronger than you, so when you make compromises, they do not respond with compromises of their own. They just see it as validation to their belief that you are weak, and it only strengthens their resolve in their ideology. But when you see cracks beginning to form in the ideology, you should seize on the moment and go for compromise. As a liberal, I believe that most people are not extremists, and just want to live a peaceful life. So if you allow that side of them to express itself, many of them will. It doesn't matter what Arafat's true intentions were. The moment he said that he accepts Israel's right to exist, he made it legitimate for other Palestinians to say so, where before they would have been considered traitors and shot. And once they are able to say it, they start to have discussions about it, and start thinking about other compromises. Thus, through small steps, we can progress towards peace. I see no other way to achieve it. Unfortunately, the PLO is not the only representative of the Palestinian people. In the 1980s, the Islamist movement Hamas first made its showing on the Palestinian street. Back then, the world was not yet aware of the true nature of Islamism, and Israel stupidly thought that Hamas would be a moderating force, so it helped it grow. But in 1988, just as the PLO was ready to change, Hamas revealed its true face as a jihadist organization. The first Hamas Charter, written that year, is arguably the most anti-Semitic document ever written. It puts even the Nazis to shame. For instance, the Nazis believe that there are two evil forces that are controlling the world from behind the scenes: the Zionists, an evil cabal of Jews, and the Freemasons, another evil cabal. Whereas Article 28 of the Hamas Charter states that the Zionist invasion is a vicious invasion. It does not refrain from restoring to all methods, using all evil and contemptible ways to achieve its end. It relies greatly in its infiltration and espionage operations on the secret organizations it gave rise to, such as the Freemasons, the Rotary and Lions Clubs, and other sabotage groups. All these organizations, whether secret or open, work in the interest of Zionism and according to its instructions. They aim at undermining societies, destroying values, corrupting consciousnesses, deteriorating character, and annihilating Islam. So, as we can see, while the Nazis blamed the Freemasons as well, Hamas just claims that the Freemasons are one of the arms of Zionism. And it goes on, here and in other articles, to blame Zionism for all the wars, violence, pestilence and social problems that affect every human society on earth. The implication is that all you have to do is to get rid of the Zionists, and the world will be a heavenly place. Like Hamas, the Nazis also did not claim that all Jews are in on the conspiracy, but only that cabal of Zionists. But since they could not point out which one of the Jews is a Zionist, and they saw the nature of Jews as the cause of Zionism, the solution was to simply kill all the Jews. But while the Nazis never publicly said that the solution is genocide, the Hamas Charter has no qualms about it, and in Article 7 it quotes a hadith that states that the Day of Judgment will not come until the Muslims fight the Jews and kill them. In short, this is anti-Semitism taken to its most extreme form. As we recall, the Oslo Agreement was based on the concept of land for peace. The Palestinians got autonomy over part of the land, and in return, they were supposed to maintain the peace, to show that Israel can trust them and give them more land. In reality, because Hamas rejected the Oslo Agreement, it did not give more peace to Israelis, but a lot more violence and bloodshed. Hamas launched a suicide bombers campaign, and the number of Israeli victims of terrorism rose dramatically. Nevertheless, the peace process soldiered on, and in 2005 Israel cleared completely out of Gaza. This was followed by Palestinian general elections, in which Hamas took part for the first time. It was an optimistic sign that maybe Hamas is willing to accept the peace process. Alas, Hamas did not only take part in the election, it also won it. This was a surprise, which was not predicted by the polls. Take heed of that. Polls taken in the Arab world are usually completely unreliable, and tend to grossly underestimate the power of Islamism. At least that's the way it was until recently. I sense that Islamism has been losing popularity lately. But in 2005 it was much stronger than anyone realized, and so Hamas won the election. I was actually optimistic about it. I thought that since Hamas now has responsibility for the fate and well-being of the Palestinian people, it will have to moderate. But Hamas showed that it is committed to only one thing, and that is jihad. At first it formed a coalition with the secular Fatah, Abu Mazen's party, but then it started to train its own police force, basically a private militia. In 2007, this force took over Gaza and murdered the Fatah people. Fatah, with the help of Israel, managed to maintain control over the West Bank, and since then the Palestinian Authority has been split between those two rival groups, and there are two Palestinian governments. The Hamas government of Gaza declared that the Oslo agreements are invalid, and that it will never ever recognize Israel's right to exist. Whenever asked about it, its leaders refused to disavow the Hamas Charter. At this point, Israel had two options. One was to announce that the peace process had failed, and reoccupy Gaza. But that would have taken us back to square one in the peace process, and all the sacrifices we made would have been for nothing. The other was to freeze things the way they are, prevent Gaza from getting stronger and becoming a threat, and wait until Gaza has a government that is committed to the peace process. This was the option that Israel chose, so it placed a blockade on Gaza to prevent it from gaining military power, and gave the Gaza government three conditions to the lifting of the blockade. It has to recognize Israel's right to exist, it has to renounce terrorism, and it has to accept the past agreements signed by previous Palestinian governments. This was in 2007, 10 years ago. I was hoping that in time, Hamas will realize that it has no choice but to give up on its ideology. I thought that the Gaza population will put pressure on them to change, so that the blockade will be lifted. But Hamas went in another direction. They thought that they could get the blockade lifted without complying with Israel's conditions. After establishing a reign of terror over Gaza, ensuring that there will be no dissenting voices, they basically turned the local population into hostages in their theater of cruelty. They turned the Gaza neighborhoods into death traps, where civilian homes are connected by underground tunnels, and booby-trapped with explosives. The strategy is to lure the Israeli forces in, and then kill as many soldiers as possible, as well as cause maximum devastation in Gaza. For that purpose, they build rockets and shoot them into Israeli civilian centers, until it becomes unbearable and compels Israel to attack Gaza. Then we get a period of quiet while Gaza rebuilds its rocket arsenal, and then it starts again. Hamas was hoping that the combination of Israeli deaths, fear of rockets, and the international pressure due to the suffering of the people of Gaza will force Israel to capitulate and lift the blockade. But Hamas miscalculated. They thought that Israel's concessions to the Palestinians were due to weakness, and that Israeli resolve will eventually fold under the pressure. but the majority of Israelis who support the peace process do it not because they are weak and afraid of war, but rather because they believe that the Palestinians also have the right to a state of their own. By the same token, we also believe that Jews have a right to a state of our own, and anyone who denies that right becomes our mortal enemy. Thus, the tough stance towards Gaza has a wall-to-wall support in Israel, which has not wavered at all throughout the last decade. Hamas made no gains, and managed to completely destroy Gaza. And now, finally, they realize that they have to change. Earlier this year, they presented a new charter, more moderate than the first. Will it be enough to make a leftist like me reevaluate my stance towards Hamas, and reconsider my support of the blockade of Gaza? Let's find out. Article 2. Palestine, which extends from the River Jordan in the east to the Mediterranean in the west, and from Ras al-Nakura in the north to al-Rashash in the south, is an integral territorial unit. It is the land and the home of the Palestinian people. The expulsion and banishment of the Palestinian people from their land and the establishment of the Zionist entity therein do not annul the rights of the Palestinian people to the entire land, and do not entrench any rights therein for the usurping Zionist entity. Right away, then, we learn that Hamas still wants all of the land for the Palestinians, and does not recognize that the Jews have rights over any part of it. So it still does not recognize Israel's right to exist. Article 15. The Zionist project does not target the Palestinian people alone. It is the enemy of the Arab and Islamic Ummah, posing a great threat to its security and interests. It is also hostile to the Ummah's aspiration for unity, renaissance and liberation, and has been the major source of its troubles. The Zionist project also poses a danger to international security and peace, and to mankind and its interests and stability. This article is all that has remained from the anti-Semitic rhetoric of the original charter. Evidently, Hamas realized that such overt and blatant anti-Semitism is hurting it diplomatically. So the anti-Semitism is reduced to a dog whistle. The new charter still claims that the Zionists are a danger to the world, but it doesn't specify how. Those in the know understand that it is because the Jews are evil, and want to take over the world. Article 16. Hamas affirms that its conflict is with the Zionist project, not with the Jews because of their religion. Hamas does not wage a struggle against the Jews because they are Jewish, but wages a struggle against the Zionists who occupy Palestine. Yet, it is the Zionists who constantly identify Judaism and the Jews with their own colonial project and illegal entity. This distinction appears in the original charter as well. As I already mentioned, this is a regular anti-Semitic trick. The anti-Semites claim that they are not against all Jews, but only against Zionists, those evil Jews who want to take over the world. But they also see the Zionists as a product of the Jewish mentality, so at the end of the day, they do blame and hate all Jews. Now, in the original charter, it was obvious that when Zionists were mentioned, it was to be understood in the anti-Semitic sense of the word, as this cabal of Jews that plots to take over the world. Here, we see that the definition of Zionism is closer to what Zionism actually is, which is the national movement of the Jews. So again, we see that the anti-Semitism is considerably toned down in this new charter. Article 19. There shall be no recognition of the legitimacy of the Zionist entity. Whatever has befallen the land of Palestine in terms of occupation, settlement building, Judaization or changes to its features or falsification of facts is illegitimate. Rights never lapse. The Zionist entity is the State of Israel. The Charter reiterates that Hamas does not recognize it and wants to dismantle it. Article 20. Hamas believes that no part of the land of Palestine shall be compromised or conceded, irrespective of the causes, the circumstances and the pressures, or no matter how long the occupation lasts. Hamas rejects any alternative to the full and complete liberation of Palestine, from the river to the sea. However, without compromising its rejection of the Zionist entity, and without relinquishing any Palestinian rights, Hamas considers the establishment of a fully sovereign and independent Palestinian state, with Jerusalem as its capital along the lines of the 4th of June 1967, with the return of the refugees and the displaced to the homes from which they were expelled, to be a formula of national consensus. This is a significant article. We see that while Hamas does not relinquish its demand to have a Palestinian state over the entire land, it is willing, at this stage, to accept a state over the West Bank and Gaza, in what is known as the 67 borders. This is reminiscent of the PLO 10-point plan, reflecting the understanding that they can't conquer Israel all at once, so they must do it in stages. This article has two main purposes. First, it allows Hamas to have a truce with Fatah, as it now accepts that Fatah has the right to negotiate a peace deal with Israel based on the two-state solution. Secondly, it allows the useful idiots in the West to claim that Hamas wants peace. There are many useful idiots in the Western academy and media who see the Palestinians as the victims and want to blame Israel for everything. But it is very hard for them to sell Hamas as the victim as long as it espouses the destruction of Israel, so Hamas needs to give them something to work with. Now we can get rhetoric like this article in The Guardian, where the title makes it seem like Hamas accepts the two-state solution. As we have seen, Hamas accepts nothing of the sort, but the new charter enables the useful idiots to spread the anti-Israel propaganda. Article 25. Resisting the occupation with all means and methods is a legitimate right guaranteed by divine laws and by international norms and laws. At the heart of these lies armed resistance, which is regarded as a strategic choice for protecting the principles and the rights of the Palestinian people. This article reiterates the group's commitment to armed resistance, in other words, terrorism. As we see, it is defined as resistance against the occupation, and the useful idiots will tell you that by occupation they mean the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, the so-called occupied territories. But, as we have seen, when Hamas says occupation, it includes the State of Israel as well. Article 29. The PLO is a national framework for the Palestinian people inside and outside of Palestine. It should therefore be preserved, developed and rebuilt on democratic foundations so as to secure the participation of all the constituents and forces of the Palestinian people, in a manner that safeguards Palestinian rights. This is interesting. Hamas historically regarded itself as an enemy of the PLO. The PLO is a secular nationalist organization, whereas Hamas is an Islamist organization. The previous charter declared that Hamas wants to replace the PLO. Here, they want to join the PLO. So this is another compromise, and we see that the new plan of Hamas is to become part of the PLO, currently dominated by Fatah, and eventually take over it. And finally, Article 39. From a legal and humanitarian perspective, the liberation of Palestine is a legitimate activity. It is an act of self-defense, and it is the expression of the natural right of all people to self-determination. Yes, unless there's any doubt left in your mind, Hamas is a liberal humanist organization that believes all people have the right to self-determination. Unless they are Jews, of course. Jews don't get the right to self-determination, because it's not convenient to us, and if they still want self-determination anyway, then they are criminal occupiers and should be killed. Okay, so those were the parts that I found relevant. Let's summarize the important points. 1. No change in the positions which Israel deems necessary to remove the blockade on Gaza. Hamas still rejects Israel's right to exist, still rejects former agreements, and is still committed to terrorism. If Hamas was hoping that this new charter will get left-wing bodies within Israel to push for moderating the tough stance against Gaza, they were very wrong. Everyone in Israel still sees Hamas as a mortal enemy. 2. The blatant antisemitism of the previous charter has been reduced to a dog whistle. I'm not impressed. 3. Compared to the previous charter, there is a lot less religious talk and a lot more emphasis on Palestinian nationality. Hamas is not so much about the caliphate right now, and more about trying to find ways to reconcile with the PLO and focus on the national struggle. 4. As part of the reconciliation efforts, Hamas gets closer to PLO on some issues. The most significant one is that they support the efforts to establish a Palestinian state in the 67 borders. But while Abu Mazen promotes it as the end goal, part of the two-state solution, Hamas sees it as merely a phase in the plan to destroy Israel. However, it is still very important. In the 90s, Hamas was opposed to the peace process, and launched a terror campaign to sabotage it. With this new stance, there is hope that they will let the peace process resume without violence. These efforts by Hamas did indeed lead to reconciliation talks with Fatah, and it looks like national Palestinian unity will be re-established. Hamas is willing to share power over Gaza with Fatah, and this may lead to an easing of the blockade. Hopefully, the people of Gaza will have a better life going forward. Bottom line, there can never be peace between Israel and Palestine as long as a big political body like Hamas is not on board with the two-state solution and doesn't accept Israel's right to exist. So we are not there yet, but this is the first time Hamas has shown any willingness to change. It is now basically where the PLO was in 1974, when it adopted the 10-point plan. It took a mere decade and a half from there for the PLO to recognize the State of Israel. So there is hope.